Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 124 called Byzantium, the Empire that Refused to Die. In the last episode, we left Otto the Great triumphant in 962 when he was crowned Emperor of the Romans in Rome. But of course, there were two Roman empires and the other was in Constantinople. And it is to this empire that we now turn for the next few episodes of this podcast. We last spoke about the Eastern Romans, or the Byzantines, in episode 113, when I described the Emperor Leo III's victory in the winter of 717-718 over an immense Umayyad army and navy intent on taking Constantinople. This was a pivotal moment in history. Few people at the time would have expected Byzantium to survive, but it did. And the Umayyad Caliphate's advance into Europe was blocked. Had Constantinople fallen, history may well have taken a different course, and the Arabs might have advanced deep into Europe, just as the Ottoman Turks would do in the 17th century when they reached Vienna. In the west, of course, Charles Martel defeated the Arabs at Tours in 732. But I think Leo III's victory at Constantinople was more significant because he was facing the full might of the Umayyad Caliphate, whereas Charles Martel was only confronting a large Arab raiding expedition. So, before we move on to the rest of Leo's reign, the question I want to ask in this episode is, how did Byzantium do it? How was it able to fend off Islam, by far the greatest power of the age? And I think part of the answer lies with the name Byzantium, because Byzantium was not Rome. In episode 113, you may remember, I suggested it was right to use the term Byzantine to describe the remains of the Roman Empire after the disastrous second half of Heraclius' reign, even though the term Byzantine is made up and the so-called Byzantines always called themselves Romans. But I think Byzantine is right because it differed greatly from the empires of Justinian and Heraclius. And the paradox is that some of the differences made Byzantium stronger than the late Roman Empire had been. Let me explain. To start with, the first and most obvious difference between Byzantium and, let's say, Justinian's Roman Empire was territorial size. The Arab conquests deprived the Roman Empire of the Levant, Egypt, and North Africa. This meant it lost over half of its territories and around 2/3 of its population and tax revenues. Never again would it be a superpower, and never again would it encompass a plethora of peoples spanning 3 continents. But despite this, Byzantium was in some ways stronger than the late Roman Empire. The first example of this was its greater political, religious, and ethnic homogeneity. The Roman Empire, even in its reduced Justinianic form, was still home to a diverse multiracial community of Greeks, Syrians, Jews, Egyptians, and North Africans. In contrast, the Byzantine Empire was overwhelmingly Greek. It must be remembered that the Greek population of the ancient world was much larger than it is today. Most of Anatolia, which is today almost exclusively Turkish and Kurdish, had a very different ethnic mix in the 7th century. Most of the inhabitants of its coastline were the descendants of mainland Greeks. And although the population of the interior was descended from a mix of Hittites, Assyrians, Armenians, and Persians, aside from the Armenians, most of them identified with a Greek culture and language. So, in Byzantium, there was cultural, racial, and linguistic unity in a way that had never existed before in the Roman Empire, even in the East. And this helped to promote greater political unity. For example, the Emperor, Patriarch and Senate were united in a single mission to survive the Arab invasions. Admittedly, this was partly because all the senators with landholdings in Egypt, North Africa and the Levant, who had often undermined the imperial government, were gone. Those that remained had their estates in Anatolia, where the Arab threat was their top priority. This unity also extended to religion. In episode 111, I described the serious religious division between Monophysites and Chalcedonians in the Roman Empire, which made it vulnerable to the Arab invasions. In Egypt, for example, some Monophysites seem to have preferred Islam to the hated Chalcedonian faith. But the benefit to Byzantium of the Arab conquests was that they removed this division by conquering almost all of the Monophysite territories. Similar to a medical operation, the diseased part of the empire, at least in the eyes of the Chalcedonians, was conveniently excised. What remained was the so-called Orthodox Byzantium, a fiercely united religious community which saw itself as the chosen people of God, determined to fight to the death against the new Arab enemy. But what made Byzantium so formidable was that it also retained some of the strengths of the late Roman Empire. And the most important examples were centralized taxation and a professional army. As I've mentioned before, these were the building blocks of ancient Rome, and they were closely linked since around 80% of taxation in the Roman Empire was spent on the army. The Byzantine maintenance of a professional army was the single most important difference between it and the Germanic kingdoms of the West. There was no professional army in the kingdoms of the Franks, Visigoths and Lombards. Why? Because they didn't have the tax system to pay for it. I want to spend a few minutes looking in detail at the Byzantine army because I think it was the single most important reason Byzantium survived, and also because there's been some controversy over what the Byzantine army was like. The key confusion lies with the Byzantine so-called theme system. These were militarized provinces created after the Arab conquests. We happen to know more about them than the equivalent administrative organizations elsewhere in the post-Roman world, partly because of a historical accident, which is the survival of copious quantities of Byzantine lead seals. What is a lead seal? They exist because the Byzantines liked to use them to stamp official government documents, providing what one historian has called the ghost of vanished archives. Although the documents themselves have long since disintegrated, the seals normally carry the name and status of the person marked on the stamp. As such, they provide an extensive record of the names and job titles of the generals and administrators who governed the Byzantine themes from the 7th century to their demise in the 12th century. The principal centre for the study of lead seals, which is called sigillography, is at Harvard University's Dumbarton Oaks Byzantine Research Department, which has over 17,000 lead seals. These have enabled historians to build quite a detailed picture of how the theme system worked, which has also led to a controversy about the structure and nature of the Byzantine army in the century after Heraclius' death. Although I don't normally dwell on the views of particular historians, I want to briefly explain one theory proposed by a historian called George Ostrogorsky. He was a Russian born in 1902 and one of the most distinguished professors of Byzantine history. He argued that the late Roman army developed into a highly effective medieval peasant army. He believed this happened after Heraclius' death, when the Roman state couldn't pay its professional soldiers in gold, as was customary, and resorted to the next best thing, which was to pay them in land. He believed peasants became soldiers in return for grants of state land, and he argued the success of the Byzantine army was because these peasants fought to preserve their livelihoods from Arab invasion. It sounds plausible. and it evokes a wonderful image of a heroic army of farmer soldiers. But he was wrong. And the truth is actually much more interesting. More recent research has shown that what saved Byzantium was not the metamorphosis of the late Roman army into a bunch of enthusiastic peasant soldiers, but the exact opposite. Byzantine success depended on preserving the highly disciplined, well-trained and well-equipped Roman army. For the truth is that the Roman army didn't die on the battlefield of Yarmouk, but survived to fight another day. Indeed, it did more than just survive, as we'll hear in future episodes. In the 9th and 10th centuries, for example, it returned to the offensive and defeated the Abbasid Caliphate. So, what really happened to the late Roman army in the century after Heraclius' death? Well, our sources tell us that in the second half of the 7th century, a desperate defence was conducted against the Arabs using the Taurus Mountains in southern Anatolia as a natural barrier. Anatolia was divided into 4 militarized zones or themes called Anatolikon, Arminiakon, Opsikion, and Thracasion in Greek. And I think it's appropriate to use their Greek names, since by this time Greek had taken over from Latin as the army's administrative language. The derivation of the word theme is obscure, but most historians think it comes from a military term used by the steppe nomads, who, as I've mentioned before, were hugely influential on the evolution of the late Roman army, meaning something like large army, or in a Roman context, a field army. And historians are now very confident that field army is exactly what theme meant, since the 4 themes created either during Heraclius' last years or shortly thereafter merely refer to the location of the 4 surviving Roman field armies. You'll remember that Roman field armies replaced many of the legions during the crisis of the 3rd century and became the Romans' elite troops. So, the Anatolikon theme was shorthand for the remains of the field army of the East, i.e. the one that had been defeated in the pivotal Battle of Yarmouk in 636, that was pulled back from Mesopotamia and Syria and based in south-central Asia Minor, defending the passes through the Taurus Mountains against the Arabs. In Greek, Anatoli means east, and Anatolikon is Greek for the Latin Exercitus Orientalis, meaning army of the east. It's also worth mentioning the modern name Anatolia is derived from the word Anatolikon. The other 3 themes similarly comprised the remains of Roman field armies. One was the field army of Armenia, which was pulled back from occupying Armenia to defend central and eastern Anatolia, where it became the Arminiakon theme. This is confusing because it wasn't actually in Armenia anymore, which had been abandoned. But the most confusing theme of all was the Thracasion theme, meaning Thracian, which wasn't in Thrace at all, but was located in western Anatolia. This was, in fact, the former Army of the West, which was normally stationed in Thrace, but the severity of the Arab onslaught meant it was moved to Anatolia. The last of the 4 themes was the Opsikion, which comprised the imperial guards regiments gathered in and outside Constantinople. So, in the second half of the 7th century, the themes simply referred to the 3 surviving Roman field armies plus the imperial guards units, all of which were pitted against the Arabs in a last-ditch stand. In future centuries, the themes would change. They became administrative as well as military provinces, and more of them were created. Also, the descendants of the field armies bought land, married local women, and raised families in the regions they were defending. So Ostrogorsky was to some extent right that the later thematic army evolved in something more like a local militia, and we'll consider the implications of this in future episodes. But in the 8th and 9th centuries, the themes were the last Roman field armies moved to Anatolia to fight the Arabs. So you're probably wondering who was defending the western provinces. We'll cover the answer in more detail in future episodes, but suffice to say, most of the Balkans were anyway now in the hands of the Avars and Slavs. There was no field army in the west, and the surviving Byzantine outposts in Greece like Thessalonica, Corinth and Athens were garrisoned with local militia, as were the surviving Italian territories including Ravenna, Rome and Sicily. So, I've spent a lot of time describing the Byzantine army, but that's because I think it was the single most important reason for Byzantium's survival. In short, the Roman army was far from dead. And as such, it was still one of the best fighting forces on the planet. And that's the main reason the Arabs didn't roll up through Anatolia and into Europe in this period. But there were other reasons to explain Byzantine survival as well. One was undoubtedly the invention and successful deployment of Greek fire. We've discussed this in past episodes where I've said it's doubtful whether Byzantium would have survived if it hadn't been able to burn the Arab fleets that were sent against it. In the Great Siege of Constantinople in 717-718, as described in episode 113, it was Greek fire which gave Leo command of the sea and ultimately left the Arab army stranded on the Bosphorus. Another reason was the defensive strength of Constantinople. The city combined a commanding strategic position with first-rate defensive architecture. Chosen by the Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century AD, its location on a peninsula alongside the Golden Horn and jutting into the deep sea of Marmara gave it an unparalleled defensive geography with two sides facing the sea and a third facing landwards. On the landward side was the 4-mile-long triple set of Theodosian land walls added in the early 5th century. Rome fell to the barbarians many times, but Constantinople survived until the Crusaders sacked it in 1204 and the Turks in 1453. And this was partly because its walls were far more difficult to storm than those which the Emperor Aurelian built around Rome in the late 3rd century AD, which stretched for nearly 3 times the length of the Theodosian walls and only had a single wall. Another reason which helped Byzantine survival was the outbreak of civil war in the Caliphate, although it shouldn't be regarded, in my opinion, as the most important reason, as some historians have claimed. This was because both of the Arab civil wars occurred after Muawiyah failed to take Constantinople, as we discussed in episode 112. The first civil war, called the First Fitna from 656 to 661, followed the failure of Muawiyah's first assault on the capital. And the second Fitna, which was between 680 to 692, which was much worse than the first and threw Islam into civil war for over a decade, was largely caused by Muawiyah's failed second assault on the imperial capital. The final proof is that Byzantium, of course, survived the Great Siege of 717-18 unaided by any internal Arab divisions. Moving on to the final factor, and one that has received little attention from historians until now, is climate history. As long-term listeners to this podcast will know, I've focused on climate history to explain things like why the Huns first migrated westwards from the Asian steppes, and also to suggest that the late antique Little Ice Age was the missing link in explaining the rise of Islam. Well, climate change was also relevant to the early period of Byzantium. This is because recent research suggests climatic changes may have been beneficial to the Byzantines in the period after Heraclius's death. In particular, various sources, archaeological and climatological, indicate Anatolia was less adversely affected by the late antique Little Ice Age than some of the hotter areas of the Mediterranean hinterland, where cooling led to reduced rainfall and drier conditions. The argument is that mountainous areas in the Mediterranean, such as Anatolia and Sicily, attracted more rain clouds than lower lying areas like Syria, and therefore benefited from wetter conditions. So, while Syria suffered from grain shortages during the late Antique Little Ice Age, grain production in Anatolia increased. This was particularly helpful for the Byzantines when the supplies of grain from Egypt and North Africa were eliminated by the Arab conquests. In conclusion, Byzantium was the empire that refused to die. As such, it changed world history, and I suggest its unexpected survival lies with a lucky inheritance from the late Roman Empire, in which it lost the worst bits like religious and political division, but retained the best bits like the Roman tax system and the Roman army. It was a winning formula. And in the 9th and 10th centuries, Byzantium would even go back onto the offensive to recover some of the lands it had lost to the Arabs. The story of the rise of Byzantium is one of the most remarkable of all the tales of the Dark Ages. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. In the next episode, on the 6th of December, we'll continue with the story of Byzantium's fight back against the Arabs. And if you like the podcast, why not leave a review, tell a friend, or best of all, sign up to my newsletter where you can get a free ebook. Just visit my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.